My name is William Collinge. I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank Dr. Dart and Commissioner Sorensen for coming. And we're looking forward to having a really informative, educational evening. They'll both be giving their presentations, and then we'll be opening it up for discussion and questions and commentary from all of you. And we aim to be finished about 8 o'clock, but if we need to spill over a little past that, that'll be fine as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Dart and look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Well, I'm Paul Dart. I'm an MD. I'm a physician in Eugene. As some of you know, I spent about 2 years leading a group of physicians who reviewed the research science on the health effects of microwave RF communications as part of an effort to communicate with eWeb about their potential choices in technology as they considered going with a smart meter program. I want to start now talking about what I've learned. I'm probably going to talk for about 30 minutes. Now, the FCC limits for microwave RF were published in 1999. And these guidelines are designed to protect people against the thermal effects of microwave RF. If you get too close to a strong transmitter, you can fry an egg or yourself. These guidelines are only designed to prevent people from thermal harm. The FCC has explicitly stated that they do not make any regulations or assurances whatsoever regarding non-thermal biological effects of lower levels of microwave RF. Now, a lot of statements from industry spokesmen will say that there isn't that much known about these biological effects, or there's insufficient or incomplete evidence, or lack of consensus with everyone in the room on this. And there's an implication that there really isn't much scientific evidence or information on this subject. I think one of the handouts here that you have would be something written by industry that would imply that. I'm not here to make assertions. I'm here to simply show you the data that is there in recent studies on this issue. And a lot of these studies were done in the last 10 years, a lot of them in the last 3 or 4 years. So the science on this is getting more and more robust. And there's significant evidence that there is cause to be concerned. So I'm going to show you that data and give you enough information so you can think for yourself whether you're concerned or not. I don't know where the music's coming from, but let's go to the next slide. Okay. I'm going to talk about 2 different kinds of problems that can occur with microwave radio exposure, which I'll call RF exposure. One is acute symptoms, where people might get headaches or ringing in the ears or dizziness or fatigue, trouble sleeping. Exposures can cause this, and they do in a certain percentage of the population. People who have high levels or disabling levels of this kind of reactivity, the syndrome is called electrohypersensitivity syndrome. And I'm going to look at research on that subject, and then we'll talk about chronic exposures, chronic effects that might involve issues regarding fertility, cancer, that kind of thing. Now, some of these studies resulted from exposure to radio and cell phone towers. Some of them come from in a lab with exposures to cell phone transmissions or Wi-Fi transmissions. We'll look at different kinds of evidence. It's all involving transmissions at similar frequencies. Now, acute symptoms of exposure to microwave radiation were first described by Russian medical researchers in the 1950s. The Russians studied this a lot, and they described a constellation of symptoms, including headaches, ocular dysfunction, fatigue, dizziness, sleep disorders, burning of the skin, increased histamine reactions in the skin, cardiovascular abnormalities, depression, irritability, and memory impairment. Oh, and I should say that everything I'm presenting and a fair amount more is available as an as a PDF with the pictures online with the state legislature, and I'll give you a link at the end of this to look at that. So don't get too obsessed with the details of the numbers here, because you can download it all and read it at your leisure later if you so wish. Now, the Russians knew that they could cause this kind of symptom, and they took advantage of this to harass the United States Embassy between 1953 and 1978. The U.S. was in this embassy, and the Russians put a transmitter on a nearby roof. Maybe it was here, I don't know, someplace close by, and beamed microwaves into the embassy. People in the embassy had a fair amount of symptoms, and they finally hired a researcher, an epidemiologist from Johns Hopkins, to study this and see what was going on. And he compared them to people in other embassies and to the population at large, and found that they had a statistically significant increase in various problems, including depression, irritability, concentration problems, memory loss, ear problems, skin problems, vascular problems, other health problems. The longer they worked there, the worse these problems were likely to be, or the more people had them, it related to their years of exposure. The problem was that the exposure levels inside the building were measured at between 2 and 28 microwatts per centimeter squared. And the FCC guidelines would allow 600 microwatts per centimeter squared, because that's the thermal exposure limit. This was pretty embarrassing to the United States government, and they kind of put this report in the drawer. They got someone to write a summary that discounted some of their own data, but the data is available, and that is what it showed. Now, in Spain in 2001, a town of 1,900 inhabitants, who cell phone towers are just being put in Europe at that point in time, they put a tower here, and someone did some research with a questionnaire. 5% of the inhabitants in the town answered that questionnaire, asking various different questions about different kinds of symptoms, asking people to score them on a 0 to 3 scale of how often they had these symptoms. They measured the power density of the signals in the bedrooms of respondents. And they looked at respondents from this central area of the community near the tower and compared them to respondents out here in an outlying area. This is a radius of 150 meters from the tower, comparing it to people who lived more than 250 meters from the tower. People in this area, their average bedroom exposure level was 0.11 microwatts per centimeter squared, with the FCC limits 600. People out here, exposure levels were 1/10 of that. And this is some of the data they found. When you see a star on one of these graphs, that means it was statistically significant in terms of the kind of statistics that are used to validate scientific studies. And they saw significant increases in the group that was close to the tower in depression, sleep disturbance, headaches, poor concentration, and irritability. Another study in France in 2002 asked 530 people responding to questionnaires regarding multiple symptoms that had been described as what was called at that time microwave syndrome by the Russian research. And they measured distance of the residents from the meters, in meters from cell phone towers. And this is what they found. The scale here is greater than 300 meters, going down to less than 10 meters. And at closer distances, people who recorded that often or very often having the symptom, here the symptom is fatigue. And at closer proximities, we see more statistically significant difference from people who lived farther away from the towers. Here's irritability, headache, sleep disruption, depression, memory loss, dizziness, cardiovascular problems, and fewer of these, but still a significant increase at the closer range from the tower. This is just some of the symptoms they asked about. A study in Egypt on the Nile south of the capital city of Cairo, where they put a tower in here and they measured they assessed symptoms in inhabitants near this tower versus inhabitants that lived more than a kilometer or two away from it. And they saw a significant increase in headaches, memory changes, dizziness, depression, sleep disturbance, tremors. This is a summary of some of their statistical findings of increased symptoms, the most common ones. Another study was done in Austria, published in 2004. They looked at people in Vienna, a big city, and people living out here in Carinthia, which was a small community out in a more rural area. And they wanted to know if people had health symptoms acutely around cell phone towers. Their criteria was that the tower had to be operational for greater than 2 years, with no local controversy about the tower, no other towers nearby when possible, transmitting a 900 megahertz band. And they did a random selection of households within the study area and had them do performance tests, asked them about symptoms, and measured the exposure levels in their bedrooms. And here are some symptoms for headaches, concentration, cold hand and feet, palpitations, stratified by exposure level measured in the bedroom in microwatts per meter squared. And with the higher exposure levels, we see higher levels of these symptoms. In Denmark, they did a large study with children looking at various symptoms in relation to whether the children had been exposed in some way to cell phones when their mother was pregnant or after the child was born. They looked at them at age 7, and they found changes in behavior problems, headaches, and hearing loss. Here, looking at behavior problems, in the first analysis they did of this, a statistical increase in risk of emotional problems, hyperactivity, conduct problems, peer problems in children who had documented pre- and postnatal exposure in the household to cell phones. In a subsequent study, they stratified the data by the level of use, based one on calls made daily. Here we have 0 to 1 calls, 2 to 3, 4 plus calls. And here we have percentage of the time the phone was turned on in the household, ranging from 0, which is the control group essentially in this study, less than 50%, 50 to 99, all the time. The more time the phone was on, the higher the risk of behavior problems were in the children. Now, we're exposed to more and more microwave RF at the current time, yeah?
These are interesting studies, but did anyone do a study before and after they put a tower in?
I'll talk about that more when I get later on in the speech, yeah.
Which of these correlations could be due to something else?
Well, that's always a possibility, but we'll get to some of that later in the report when we're looking at cancer research, yeah. Now, in France, in urban areas, the average exposure levels increased tremendously between 2000 and 2011. And a lot of researchers think that this line here is about the top level that ought to be permitted at about 0.1 microwatts per centimeter squared, or 1,000 microwatts per meter squared. But our exposure level has been increasing as the cell phone infrastructure and the wireless communication infrastructure have been rolled out over the last 15 years. This happened first in Europe. So the first cell phone networks were in Finland and Sweden. And they started seeing symptoms from this before we did here in the States. Research has been done in various places just finding out what percentage of the population reports that they get symptoms from exposures to cell phones, Wi-Fi, things like that. And this is showing various studies over the last 10 or 15 years from 95. This is an extrapolation of a potential endpoint if this kept increasing. It's a geometric scale here, so that would be 50%. But in here, at this point, we've seen studies in the early aughts talking about 3 to 5%, and studies in Austria where they came back and looked at it again 3 or 4 years later. There's a higher level of self-reporting, of people reporting they have symptoms from this. It's certainly true that we are more exposed than we used to be, and something that was pretty rare 30 years ago seems to be becoming more common. Now, in the last 4 or 5 years, it's become more clear how microwave RF can cause stress in cells in living tissues. And it appears the evidence really strongly supports the hypothesis that this is done by increasing oxidative stress in cells. When you listen to people talk who are claiming that there's nothing to worry about, they talk about the electromagnetic spectrum here, where visible life is here. Here's X-rays, here's gamma rays. These are forces of energy that can break covalent bonds in DNA and cause mutations. And scientists learned in the early 1900s, they learned the hard way that radiation from X-rays and from radioactivity can cause cancer by breaking DNA. The microwave spectrum's way down here. This is radio and TV. Up here, we're talking about where we're getting into radar and cellular communication levels of frequency. So these levels of power are not strong enough to break a covalent bond in a molecule and damage DNA themselves. And apologists for the industry will say that because this energy isn't strong enough to do that, there's no way that these things can cause cancer or other problems. And they'll state that the response of the organism is going to be based on the power of the impact of the insult, and because these aren't that powerful, they can't cause harm. Now that sounds like great physics, but it's a very poor analysis of biology, because the effect of an irritant isn't determined by the force of the irritant, it's determined by the response of the organism. How does the physiology of the organism respond to that? There are many things that aren't ionizing radiation that can cause cancer. Tobacco can cause cancer. Genital warts can cause cancer. Asbestos can cause cancer. It doesn't take, an ionizing radiation is not the only way that cancer can be produced. Now, what seems to be the case with microwaves is that microwaves increase the level of production of free radicals within living tissue in cells. Our body produces free radicals all the time. It stores them up in peroxisomes here that are used to attack and destroy bacteria in the body as part of the immune response. And strong oxidizing molecules that are made by the body as a defense mechanism can break covalent bonds. They can tear tissues apart completely. And cells are making free radicals all the time as part of our physiology. With inflammation, these are released. A research paper published in 2013 showed evidence from 23 different studies that document that electromagnetic fields can produce physiological effects that alter the function of calcium entry into cells and increase the production of free radicals of oxidation within the cells. Our cells have gated calcium channels that can open or shut more depending on physiology. Exposure to magnetic fields at many different levels of magnetic field frequency will open up these gates farther, and this increases the action of this enzyme producing more nitric oxide, which in turn creates peroxynitrite, which increases the production of NO2 and of the hydroxyl radical, increasing oxidative stress in tissues. So the microwave radiation doesn't break cell structures itself, but it alters our metabolism, creating more oxidative production of oxidants in the cells that creates inflammatory damage. And there's a great deal of evidence showing that microwave RF does cause oxidative damage to cells and to DNA. This is an electrophoretic method of measuring fragmentation of DNA, where This is complete DNA, and fragments don't move through the gel as quickly and leave a trail behind them. It's called the comet assay. And when you see a lot of fragments like this, a tail, it means that the DNA is broken and there's pieces of it that aren't the same size. So it spreads out as it moves across a diffusion gradient. And you can measure that tail. And this is looking at a measurement of DNA fragmentation in rat brains that were exposed to a level of microwaves 1/3 of the FCC limits, 2 hours a day for 35 days. And what they saw was longer heads and tails of this spread, documenting DNA damage. At the same time, they saw decrease in the amount of oxidants in the tissue of the exposed animals, a significant increase or significant decrease in molecules that are used up protecting the body against oxidation, including melatonin. And again, this is 2 hours a day for 45 days at this fairly low level of exposure. Now I'm going to change the subject. I've talked about acute effects. I've talked about the physiologic basis for this. And as I say, there's stuff available online that I've written that will give you a much more detailed discussion of all this if you desire that. Now I want to talk about consequences, chronic consequences of oxidative stress that can damage DNA. One way to look at that is to look at people that have been exposed to a lot of radio for a long time. And a study was done looking at the mortality in members of the California branch of Ham Radio Association. And someone looked at the death statistics of all these people over a period of from 1971 to 1983. And what they found was significant increases in ham radio operators of leukemias. All of them, and of various specific types of leukemias. Similar findings.
The y-axis?
Good question. I'd have to go to my written stuff to figure that out.
On all of the tables, charts, it would be nice to know what the y-axis is.
Yes, and I didn't write that in on this one. That's my bad. Most of them I can tell you what the y-axis is. And I'm not sure what that is. It may be the statistical rate compared to normal. I'm not sure. I mean, but I don't want to speculate on that. In the Polish military, this is odds ratio of cancer incidence. So that's the y-axis, is the odds ratio in cases and in controls. And what they found was people that had higher exposures occupationally in their military jobs had increased risk of all types of cancers, gastrointestinal, brain, blood, and various types of leukemia. And all of these differences in terms of odds ratio were statistically significant. I mean, this is an odds ratio of 14 times the risk, which makes the odds of that being random are like 0.001. In a study of Navy Korean War veterans, again looking at their job in the Navy, how much RF exposure they had, if you stratify that into low, intermediate, and high radar exposure, there was higher risks of various kinds of cancer in that group. And this is a large cohort of individuals. Looking at U.S. Air Force workers with occupational exposures, pilots have more exposure because they're up in front where the radios are, and they had a significant increase in the odds ratio for brain tumor. This is odds ratio here, with 1 being this would be no difference. And this is their exposure intensity score times the months exposed. An analysis of leukemia deaths of children near the powerful Vatican radio transmitters showed a relationship between the proximity in kilometers here and the number of leukemia cases in children. Now, in Netanya, Israel, in 1997-98, they set up a cell phone tower in 96. And the power density in the exposed area that they looked at was below 0.53 microwatts per centimeter squared, with the FCC guidelines being 600 microwatts per centimeter squared. And they looked at cancer rates during the second year of exposure, comparing them to matched controls living at the same time in another area of the city, farther away from this tower, which was placed down at the beach here. And this is what they saw in men, in women, and the combined rate. And for women, the cancer rate was 10.5 times higher in the population more exposed to the tower. In Austria, a similar study was done looking at a tower that had been operating from 84 to 97, and they did a case control study of cancer patients living within a 1,200 meter radius of the tower. And this is the odds ratio, with 1 being no difference. And they stratified it by the exposure level outside the building that the person lived in. And the people that had an exposure level of 1,000 microwatts per meter squared, the FCC guidelines in microwatts per meter squared is 6 million is the tolerated level for thermal risk. But people with over 1,000 here had quite an increase in cancers, especially breast cancer and brain cancer. In Belo Horizonte, Brazil, a study was published in 2011. This is a city of 2 million plus people that was rated by the UN in 2007 as having the best quality of life in Latin America. By 2006, there were 856 cell phone towers in the city. What they did was they found out where all those towers were. And then they used death certificates and death data in the population to find out where everyone who died of cancer in the city during that time, between 96 and 2006, lived. And then they could look and measure the distance between the person who died and the closest cell phone tower in meters. And this is the curve of that data. The closer they were, the higher the death rate from cancer was. This is 500 meters here. And at levels closer than that, this was a statistically significant difference in cancer death rate. Now, if we drew a 500-meter radius around the Crossfire Ministries site, we're not in that. There's Tugman Park. Parker School is completely within that radius. Spencer Butte's just outside of it. That will be the radius of people that had that level of exposure. Now, I want to talk about the effects of microwaves on fertility, and information has been shown there. They've looked at fruit flies, a study done just in the last 2 years, at 100 times below FCC guidelines. They exposed them for one interval per day for 5 days. And different flies for different amounts of time. Here's 1 minute per day, 6, 11, 16, 21. And they saw a decrease in fertility of the flies. It's a little disturbing because flies aren't that disturbed by radiation exposure. They seem to be more sensitive to microwave RF than to nuclear radiation, for example. In mammals, several studies have been done. A study in Greece put female mice in cages in a VHF-UHF radio TV antenna park, and at exposures about 1,000 times lower than the FCC guidelines. And then they bred them repeatedly. And what this is matings that produced litters and how many infants were produced in those litters. And by the 5th mating, all of the female mice were sterile. And when it was irreversible when they took them to an unexposed area later. Another study in male rats looking at 10 gigahertz exposure shows decreased sperm counts in the exposed for a fifth of the FCC guidelines, 2 hours a day for 45 days. Yeah.
Isn't that a possibility for the human population over the course of the next 60 to 80 years?
Well, let's talk about this later, but give me time to go through the rest because I've got some data on human studies too. okay? I want to just show the data now, and we'll have a question and answer period later. This is an example where rats were exposed to standard Wi-Fi gateway 24 hours a day for 20 days, and they had more evidence of damaged DNA and various molecular compounds in the exposed rats. Significant increase in exposure and testicles were abnormal in the exposed rats. A study done with birds looked at birds, storks, living closer and farther from a cell phone tower site in Spain. There were 30 nests within 200 meters of the antenna, and they compared it with 30 nests greater than 300 meters away. And what they saw was the animals that were closer to the antenna had less total productivity and significantly more nests without young. A study with amphibians looked at frogs in a habitat about 140 meters from some cell towers. And they put some of them and their eggs in Faraday cages that protected them from the field and compared the ones in the protected cages with the others. And this is mortality in percent in the two groups in amphibians. Now in humans, sperm counts have been going down for the last several decades. And there's some question of whether pesticides are part of this, but there's evidence that microwave can cause problems with humans too. Here in this study, they looked at people, human sperm with 5 minutes exposure, 10 centimeters from a transmitting cell phone, and saw less sperm moving quick, less sperm moving slow, and more sperm that wasn't able to move at all. Here's a study of semen from men in a university clinic, looking at their sperm and asking them about cell phone use habits. Here's these people used it less than 15 minutes a day, more than 60 minutes a day on the cell phone, and the higher exposure group had a reduction in rapidly motile sperm. And here's another study showing that people here, this is not using a cell phone, less than 2 hours a day, red is 2 to 4, blue is over 4, and the more use of the cell phone per day reported by these 361 men in an infertility clinic, the lower their sperm counts, motility, viability, and normal morphology were. And here's a study done under completely isothermal conditions looking at sperm exposed to RF source with less vitality, motility, an increase in reactive oxygen species. That's these strong oxidating molecules. Someone in Argentina last year put sperm at lap distance from a laptop computer for 4 hours while the computer was transmitting, about 3.5 centimeters, where your balls would be if you had one of these things on your lap transmitting. And they incubated them in keeping the temperature level and saw a significant decrease in progressive sperm and a significant increase in immobile sperm and fragmented DNA. Now, whenever you talk about this with people, what they say to you is, well, if this is a problem, how come all the studies say that cell phones are not dangerous, that cell phones are fine? And the fact is that that's not what the studies show. This study, the Interphone study, was supported, financed by the cell phone industry. And a regular user was defined as someone who made a call a week for at least 6 months. So they diluted out the study, a lot of people who didn't use a phone very much. And then they looked at that, divided into 10 groups statistically, and the bottom 9 groups, they didn't see any effect. So they said in their final conclusion, we saw no trend of increased risk. Because they didn't. There was no trend. There was a threshold above a certain level of use. And above that level of use, where here, 7 years of cell phone use, number of hours of use over 7 years, the highest risk group with over 3,000 years of use had almost twice the risk of glioma and meningioma in the brain. A study from the Hardell group in Sweden that was not funded by the cell phone industry, I think it was funded by grants from the Swedish government, found increased tumor risk for any brain cancer with hours of use. And they are the only study that looked at cordless phones, cell phones, and people that used both. This is 1 to 1,000 hours of lifetime use. 1 to 2,000 hours, and over 2,000 hours. And they saw increased risk with cordless, mobile, or with both. And for some tumors like gliomas and astrocytomas, that risk was significantly higher. They also found that if people started using a cell phone before age 20, they had a significantly higher risk than people across all age groups or people who started using a phone later on in life. Young people's skulls aren't as thick, and that's part of the problem here. And for some tumors like, say, astrocytoma that are pretty nasty brain tumors, the risk is over 4 times higher if you started using a cell phone before age 20. Now, these are not common tumors, but we're looking at a significantly increased risk for having them under those circumstances. Another study published this year in France found very similar information, and this is my last slide. This is the control group versus the top 10th of their exposure group, and they've stratified it 3 years. Here, more than 15 hours a month of exposure, 4 times the risk. Greater than 896 hours total exposure, about 3 times, a little less than 3 times the risk. Greater than 18,360 calls, that's the top 10th of their cohort was greater than that, about twice the risk of a glioma, which is one kind of cancer of the brain. Now, those of you who've got more questions about the details of these studies, the graphs and all that, the next thing to do would be to go to this website where the Oregon State government has posted the materials presented them by myself and by Dr. Paul last week.